Hey friends! Have you ever felt like you wish you could get more of a harvest out of the space that you have? Or have you ever planted something only to end up with a crop for only a short period of time and then wish it could have been a little bit more prolonged of a period of time? Well, if either of these things are issues that you have had, succession planting may just be something that you want to look into. Succession planting is something I've been using for several years now, and I've had good success with it. So I want to share with you my 5 ways that I do this. But before I get started, I would just like to read a quick definition of basically what succession planting is. It's using different techniques to achieve a staggered harvest or efficient use of space and timing. So the number one way that I do this is to plant a short season crop first early in the season, and then once it finishes off, plant another short season crop, and then sometimes, depending on how well the weather cooperates, I'll plant a second short season crop after it. So 3 times with the same crop, or different crops, excuse me, but in the same amount of space, if that makes sense. So here where I live in Colorado, sometimes we would need something to extend the garden season in order to have this, achieved. But sometimes, where there's warmer weather, this could really easily be done without having to do that. So, small like low tunnels or hoop houses or cold frames and things like that, even greenhouses that are detached from the house or unheated, can achieve this really easily as well. But essentially what you do is you plant, again, the short season cool weather crop, which can be anything like lettuce, spinach, peas, radishes, carrots, broccoli, and even sometimes people have had success with turnips. For me, the greens have been the most useful. Probably spinach, lettuce, peas, and then radishes have been the shortest season crops for me. And so once we plant those and then they, end up bolting, you can't use the lettuce anymore because they should be planted fairly early in the year. They're pretty cold hardy and whatnot. And then once the heat of the summer starts coming out, again, they'll bolt, the radishes will get spicy, things like that. It's no good anymore. Well, just to leave that space where they were growing once you've pulled them up or, cut them down or whatever, open, until you can plant something else in the fall would kind of be inefficient. So what I tend to do is I'll have my greens growing, and then once the weather starts to warm and then they're done, I'll replace them with a short season warm weather crop. My personal favorite is bush beans. Bush beans are so fast. So you put them in the ground. I mean, I've heard other people do it with like squash or cucumbers, but my personal favorite is bush beans. And then once those have finished, they've grown their beans and whatnot, they're done, you can finish those off and then plant another cool season crop after that. So I've had really good success with this method. It is really efficient use of space, getting 3 crops out of something all in the same year. So yeah, that was the number one way that I recommend succession planting to make the best use of your garden space. Second way I do this is using the same seeds but at staggered times. So say I have a zucchini that finishes or should reach maturity at about 55 days. Well, what I'll do is I'll put that in some seed pots, and so those are already be ready for transplant. Then when I go to transplant them in the garden, I'll have the plants already started that are like 2 or 3 weeks at least older, and then I'll plant some seeds at the same time of the same variety. So that way the first ones come to maturity, they kind of start to taper off. The next ones, the seeds, now pick up, and so you get more after that. Does that make sense? So it's using the same seeds, but planting them at different times so that you can be harvesting at different times. So then you don't end up with a huge crop of something all at once. You have a more usable crop, smaller amounts that you can continue to use for a longer period of time. The third way would be to use different maturity dates for the same crops. So say instead of planting, the same zucchini variety, what you could do is plant one with a maturity date of 45 days and then another one with a maturity date of 70 days. So the first one will be real early, quick, it'll start producing, and then when that one's tapering off, the next one will be ready. So you did the same planting, you had the same amount of work on the same day, but because they had different maturity dates, you'll actually get a harvest across a more broad time of the year. Another example of this would be potatoes. Potatoes usually have early, mid, and late varieties, and so if you plant all 3, you can be having some potatoes kind of earlier in the summer, some midsummer, and then maybe hopefully a huge crop later on so that you can have those into the fall. Late varieties are the best to store, so you could have some to set aside and then even continue using those into the winter. So there's another example of different ways you can use things that mature at different times to achieve the same thing, you know, a more staggered harvest. The fourth way would be to utilize transplants. So if you were to transplant something, like I mentioned earlier, into the garden, you're going to get a better harvest out of it than if you were to actually just put some seeds in the ground and then wait for it to take its time. So another way that you could achieve this is for the fall crops. So say you think, you know, our winter comes early, you know, and it goes from hot weather to cold pretty quickly, you know, how would I achieve a fall crop? Well, transplants may be the answer for that. So say you were to start some transplants in August when everything is still in full swing. Well, by the time, you know, September comes, maybe later September, the frosts have killed everything off. Now those plants are like a month old. You could pop them in the ground, so they're actually still growing inside as you're growing those transplants while everything else is still finishing up outside, so that the times can actually overlap, thus increasing efficiency. So yes, definitely utilizing transplants can definitely help make your succession planting more successful. And then the fourth way would be interplanting. Interplanting something that's fast growing with something that's slower growing and maybe takes up more space. So my favorite way to do this is actually a way before I even knew there was such thing as succession planting. I tried this out in my garden. I planted all my tomatoes, and of course tomatoes are huge, so they take up tons of space. So what I did is, you know, you plant them really, really far apart. You have all this open soil space in between. It can take a little while before they actually get big enough to take up all that space, but you definitely want to make sure they have all that space, otherwise they won't be as productive, of course. But if you can sow some, you know, quicker crops in between, those can be growing and then done before those other crops actually get big enough to need that space. So again, using the example of tomatoes, if you plant a bunch of your tomatoes in a garden bed and then you sow a bunch of, say, lettuce in between, the lettuce will grow real quick and be done before that tomato even gets big enough to miss that space. So you can utilize your space more efficiently, again, just by interplanting things at different, you know, growing rates in between the things that, you know, need something that needs more space with something that's like faster growing. There you go. I hope for these 5 techniques have been helpful to you to help get the most out of the garden space that you have, so that you can get the biggest harvest out of even a smaller amount of space, just by utilizing the amount of soil that you have most efficiently, and help to, you know, make it to where your crops are ready at a, you know, a more sustained time, so that you actually end up having, you know, a harvest that's not a ton of something all at once. You know, you can actually have a more usable amount of things for a longer period of time. So hopefully this video was helpful to you. I'm Tawny, the Frugal Growing Girl. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.